about ready to begin. We'd like to welcome you all here to our final presentation on our work with the Downtown LA History Tour. Thank you all for being here. Not all of us have had the pleasure of being introduced to one another, so we'd like to take a moment to introduce ourselves. I'm Tess, I'm a junior.
I'm Zeke, I'm a senior.
And I'm Marissa, I'm also a senior.
And now we're going to present to you our final findings on our project. So at the beginning of the semester when we were given this project, we set for ourselves an aim to kind of guide us through the whole process of doing all the different parts of the project. And I'll read that to you now. So it's to create the materials necessary to install a museum in the streets for Lewiston and Auburn, so as to increase the sense of place for residents and offer visitors a window into LA history and culture, which we will unpack further into this presentation.
So the aim leads into the 4 objectives that we eventually settled on for this project. And those objectives, the first one is to select the optimal placement for each of the 30 signs. The second objective was to revise and edit the text of all of the drafts for each one of the panels. The third objective was to write drafts of the text for the 2 introductory panels. And the fourth objective was to select appropriate photos for each sign. And for the remainder of this presentation, we'll go through each one of these objectives and our findings in each, objective by objective.
So objective 1 deals with the selection of the optimal placement of each sign. And so to complete this objective, we walked the path and recommended exact placement within each location plot point on the map for the finalized route with 4 criteria in mind: accessibility, proximity to the subject of the sign, followability along the path, and the visibility of the sign itself, which we'll also detail later in this presentation.
And so this is the final route, potentially, for the Museum in the Streets walking trail that we were using to find the spots where we would optimize the sign location. So we'd go to each spot on the map and then try and figure out where we think the sign would work best.
So for the site selection method itself, we had 3 separate steps. Step 1 was to consider the criteria, which again we'll detail further into the presentation. But the 4 again were proximity, visibility, accessibility, and followability. And we considered each of those criteria at each plot point that we visited. Step 2 was to rank each site, each proposed site. So for each location, we set the goal of having between 1 and 3 exact placement locations within that plot point, and then developed a numerical ranking system on how to objectively judge each one of those sites, which we'll detail later. And then step 3 is to produce the actual sign placement suggestions, which comes in the form of a Google Doc that has all of the pictures taken of proposed site locations or sign placements within each location, with the rankings right next to each photo.
And so returning to that step number 2, creating that ranking system for the signs, for the site locations, we developed this is a more developed criteria, and it has 4 different elements to it that we considered. So the first was accessibility, and that's what we prioritized most with sign placement. And the sentence up at the top is kind of a guiding statement to help you to walk through the whole chart once it's all visible. So to ensure the accessibility of the path and its signs, is or does this sign, and then you go through and read what deserves a ranking of 3, what deserves a ranking of a 2, and a 1. So to get a ranking of a 3, the sign has to be close to the path, have a ramp if necessary, and is at a proper height so that it's accessible to those in wheelchairs potentially, and to people all heights. Everyone can be able to read it. 2, the sign would be close to the path, but maybe there's no ramp, so less accessible to certain audiences. And then 1, inaccessible to those with handicaps and disabilities. So it's not optimal in most respects.
And so our second most valued criterion was visibility. And again, this means like can you see the sign in all weather conditions in all seasons? And so to earn a score of 3, the sign would have to not be blocked by snow or leaves in any season. So like snow builds up on the sides of roads, and so that's a big consideration for this path in the winter. And then like in the summertime, making sure that there aren't branches with leaves covering, or summer or spring, covering the signs so that patrons can see the signs in any condition. And then a score of 2 would be potentially blocked because like snow builds up everywhere. That's kind of a big consideration for us on our minds now because there has been a lot of snow. And so it's potentially blocked in some conditions. And then 1 would be poor visibility under like most conditions, so like blocked by a branch or a snowbank, and that's like an inevitable thing that it will happen.
And the third element is proximity, and this is in regards to the sign's proximity to the subject of the sign. So to earn a score of 3, the sign should be close to the physical thing in the sign content and visible while reading the sign. So whatever you're reading about in the sign, you could see right in front of you, like if it were a building. And then a 2, the sign might face away from the subject of the sign content. That can happen due to being placed like across the street if that's the only placement it can have. And then a 1 has no proximity to the subject, which is unavoidable for some signs because they're talking about things that aren't physical. Like cultural signs, you wouldn't be able to look at the culture in front of you.
And then the 4th criterion was followability, and this refers to the ability for trail visitors to understand the flow of the path from where the sign's placed. And so to earn a 3, it would be clearly visible from the sign where you're standing where the last point is and the next point that you need to go to is, without use of a map or anything. And then a 2 would be, you'd kind of be able to guess where the path leads, but you wouldn't be able to see the next sign. And then a 1 would mean that it's hard to follow unless you have a map with you.
So in total, each potential sign location can get a score of 12, and so this is how we kind of add it all together so that we can determine numerically which is the most optimal position for the sign. And these 4 elements are all objective categories. So we did not include a category for aesthetics, which might play into it if we want to place the sign somewhere more aesthetically pleasing, but that's more subjective. So we did not include that in this set of criteria.
And now we'll go through an example at the first site along the path just to explain the process of ranking each photo. And so here we have option 1. So the first site concerns logging drives. And so this is looking out, it's kind of at the start of the path near where the falls are. And so option 1 is on a platform that looks out. Option 2 is a little bit further up the path, also looking out onto the river. And option 3 is even further up from option 2, again looking out on the river. And this is a screenshot of the aerial view of where the site will go. And so option 1 is on this platform, as I referenced before. Option 2 is again further up the path, and then option 3 is at the corner of the fences. And that's just to kind of situate where we think these signs should go. And as you can see, the map shows the plot being a little bit further down the path, but we thought that being able to see the river would be nice while reading the sign, so that's why we considered these 3 options.
So option 1 is on that octagonal wooden platform that we've talked about. It received a score of a 3 for visibility. There's no trees that might cover it during any season. No snow would build up to a point that it would be inaccessible, which plays into accessibility also getting a score of a 3. It's along the Auburn River Walk, which is all paved and all flat, so there's no steps that anyone would have to go over, which makes it very accessible. And also the height would be at a relatively accessible rate or height for all visitors. Followability has a 1, but that's kind of unavoidable because it's a very isolated spot and it's the first spot along the Riverwalk. but because the only way you can get back to Auburn is along that pathway, you'll eventually run into the other sign. So it's a 1, but it's kind of a 1. And then proximity, it gets a 3 because it's looking right onto the top of the falls where the logging drives would have been situated.
The second option, and you can see in the little brown rectangle, that's where we would propose the sign be placed. It scores a 3 for visibility, just like the first option, because during all seasons, visitors on the path will be able to look at the sign, and so there won't be any trees obstructing its view. For example, snow most likely won't build up that high. And accessibility, it scored a 2 instead of a 3 like the last option. And the reason is because if you look at the bottom part of the photograph, you'll see it's slightly off the paved part of the path. So it's on the dirt, it's a little bit double pitched, a little bit uneven ground, and so that makes it a little bit less accessible to those who, for example, may be in wheelchairs or have other disabilities. So we docked it 1 point on accessibility. Followability is still a 1, just like option 1, and as Tess mentioned, that's in large part because it's the first sign on the path, and you can't see sign number 2 from any of these 3 locations. So relative to the other locations we're considering, it's right on par, but overall followability is still a 1. Proximity is a 3 because you have a nice clear view of the Androscoggin right above the falls where the loggers would take the logs out of the river.
And then option 3 ranks the same as option 2 for many of the same reasons. It's a little bit further up the path, which means accessibility is more of an issue, especially because this is dirt. In some weather conditions, it could turn to mud, and that's like really, truly inaccessible for a lot of people. Visibility, again, would score a 3 because there aren't any branches or other obstructions in the way. Followability, again, it's the first point, so it scores a 1 because it inevitably would be kind of hard to find the next location. And then proximity is a 3 because, again, you have a clear view of where the logging drives would have been in the past.
And so based on our scores, the site that we selected was option 1. It got a 10 out of 12 for its raw score, and the other 2 sites got 9 out of 12s. And again, you might want to include an aesthetic score for this. Some people might not find the chain link fence or any of the locks aesthetically pleasing, which would make it lose points in that category if we were including that. But for our purposes, we just stuck to the objective elements.
So the second objective was to revise and edit the text of all of the sign drafts for the 30 smaller panels. And we did so by grading each, well, not so much grading, but revising and editing according to 4 different criteria. So we wanted to make sure that each one of the sign drafts met those 4 criteria. The first criteria was length. Each draft had to be less than 786 characters with spaces. And the second criteria was that it was at an accessible reading level, which we determined to be between 9th and 11th grade on the Flesch-Kincaid scale. And that's because the average reading level of most newspapers in the US is between 9th and 11th grade. The third criteria is pretty understandable. There should be no spelling and grammar mistakes. And the fourth is that the titles match the content of the sign. And throughout this process, the titles have changed and the content's been revised. So we had to go back and make sure that all of the titles still match the content at the very end. So now we'll explain the methodology in more detail about revising and editing these texts. So the first step of the process is to do a first read-through. What ultimately happened is Doug kindly sent the drafts to our way, and so we then did a first read-through, and that meant opening up the Word document and reading the text out loud, word by word, and pausing after each word, because as we all know, when you're reading something in your head, your mind goes into autocorrect. So in order to avoid that, you have to really sit down and take your time with it and actually give those pauses in between each word. And along the way, while you're reading them, we made suggestions for grammar and content changes, although mostly grammar and spelling. And we did so using track changes, Microsoft Word's track changes feature. So that way, the revisions that we suggest were not set in stone, and we could hand the drafts back to our community partners afterwards, and they could decide, and we could have a discussion about which revisions to keep and which ones not to keep. And then there's the second step. So after the first read-through, we ensured that all 4 of those criteria that I explained last slide were met. And to do this, we were aided with Microsoft Word spell check feature, which of course gives grammar and spelling suggestions, but there's definitely one caveat that doesn't catch everything. So we really had to use our discretion and read really slowly to make sure that we were catching all the spelling and grammar mistakes. We also used Microsoft Word's word count feature to get the Flesch-Kincaid reading level and the character count, because those were 2 of the 4 criteria. So that leads us into the third step of the process, which was to make revisions. And so if we fell short on any of the 4 criteria and identified that in step 2, step 3 is to go back and actually make the revisions to make sure that, that the signs all comply with all 4 criteria. And that leads into step 4, which is the second read-through. So by the time you get to step 4 of the process, in theory, the sign should have met all 4 criteria in step 3. And that's why the double check is the second read-through. And once again, you read the text, slow down, word by word, and if everything seems to check out, then we send the text back to our community partners. So here's an example. Please don't read this text. Many of you have seen it before, and we're not trying to strain your eyes. But this is just an example of what the process looked like for us. So you can see in the right-hand pane, there's the track changes that we made. And most of the changes were for spelling and grammar and little things that we noticed. We did happen to make a couple suggestions for content changes, some for clarity, some for just quality of writing. And at the bottom, you'll notice in red, it says 784 characters with spaces. So we just kept little notes of how many characters were in each of the sign drafts, making sure that it was less than 786. And there's also the Flesch-Kincaid level. So we kept track of all of that. Yeah, this is sign 18, just an example.
And so now moving into objective 3, so our third objective was to write the drafts of the 2 introductory panels for Lewiston and Auburn, which will show where each of the sites are, or all of the sites are. And so the criteria for these 2 panels were that they'd be 475 words approximately, have brief histories of the 2 cities, and again be written between the 9th and 11th grade reading level, because as Zeke said, that's the level at which most American newspapers are written. And so the process for writing the introductory panels were researching and writing, which we have as step 1 and 2, but they kind of happened at the same time. So we'd research and write, or we'd research, write, but then research again to make sure that what we had written was accurate. So they were both kind of happening at the same time. And then step 3 was just ensure compliance with the criteria that we listed on the previous slide, making sure that they meet the word count and the histories are accurate, and that the 2 signs are inviting to visitors, and like draw visitors in to want to follow the path. And so this is an example of one of the introductory signs in Bar Harbor, which we used to we followed this sign kind of as a guide of how to write the signs the drafts that we did. And so yeah, we looked through and saw kind of how those signs flowed and based our writing off of that. That was just an example of an introductory sign.
All right, so our 4th objective was to select appropriate photos and images for each sign. And this entailed scanning historical photos to feature on each sign. So the photos should clearly display the sign's subject, retain high resolution, and accurately represent people and cultures featured, which we'll unpack a little. So we created our own original set of criteria for all images that all the images have to comply with. The first element of that is that the intended subject of the photo is obvious. So we want people to be able to look at the photo and know what they're looking at, and that it very easily can be seen why it pertains to the sign content. The second element is that clarity of the image is valued over a color image. If we have a really high resolution, high quality black and white photo, and then a maybe not so high quality color photo, we're going to value that black and white image and use that one instead, because color doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. The third element is that quality of the image is valued over having a larger quantity of images. We'd rather have 1 or 2 really high quality images than maybe like 4 lower quality images, because it doesn't really help to get the point of the sign across to have all of these images that are maybe not so easy to see or understand. And then the fourth element is that photos with no copyrights or copyrights to the Historical Society are preferred. And this is more just to make it easier on all of us, that we use photos that we don't have to email websites or make phone calls to get the copyrights for. We can just use the stock that we already have the rights to. And then besides the criteria that we've set for all the images, we also have 3 subcategories of images that have their own mini sets of criteria, which we will unpack right now. So if the sign features a person or a people, then the images accompanying that sign will either show the person or people, or display the person's or people's physical contributions or landmarks related to them. So this first image is a portrait of Edward Little, and that's for the sign Edward Little House, which is perfect. It shows him, and that's related to the sign content. But if we didn't have this image, or if we wanted to supplement it with another image, we would use the second image, which is of Edward Little Institute, which is a physical landmark related to him.
And so the second subcategory refers to buildings or structures. And in this case, we want to clearly indicate where the building or structure is. So with the first photo, that's the Knight House, which is the second point on the map and on the path. And then the second is clearly designate where the building used to be. And so this picture is of the LL Bean store in Auburn on Main Street, which is no longer there. Now it's like the first store is Gritty's, and the Land Trust is also on that street. So we want to clearly show where and how the building used to look in the past.
The third subcategory of photographs is if the content features a culture or a community or cultural history. And in that case, the images that accompany that text will either display the daily cultural activities and avoid stereotyping and stylizing the group being portrayed, or it can display related cultural artifacts, and especially if those cultural artifacts are talked about in the text of that sign. So there's also a category of photo selection for those photos that involve representing a community and a cultural history. And so we have a totally independent set of criteria and methodology for selecting photos that explicitly involve social representation. And so the first step of that process is to reach out and systematically start conversations with the groups that are being portrayed. So for example, we are blessed to have Tom from Maine Wabanaki reach here today because that way we can have discussions after this in our meeting about the photos that we're considering for the 2 signs that feature Wabanaki history. And so what the 3 of us did is we systematically went through each of the 30 signs and looked at their content and determined whether they fall into this category of explicitly involving social representation. And we made a list of those signs, and so to try to reach out to the groups that are being portrayed. And after that, we tried to start conversations to the best of our ability with members of that group. And so now at this stage in the process, we are having conversations with those groups, and that really feeds into step 2, which is when we open up the discussion between us and those members of the community being represented to also include our community partners. So that way there's a 3-way conversation now between ourselves, our community partners, and members of the groups being represented. And we receive feedback from members of the groups, such as Maine Wabanaki Reach, and we present that feedback to our community partners, and that really just opens that three-way dialogue, and everyone has the ability to provide their input. And that leads into the third step of the process, which is to continue the conversations between all of the parties involved, and it's collectively assessing different options. So different options for how the text can appear on those signs, and specifically for how the photographs, which photographs we choose, and we can show members of the groups that are being portrayed which photographs we're considering and have their input. And the end goal is to come up with photos to use that everyone's in agreement with. So this process really is cyclical because it involves conversations and bringing in new parties, and that's the methodology for selecting photos when it comes to social representation. So we had some more specific criteria that we drew from the literature that in terms of what we're looking for. So hypothetically, if we can't communicate or get in contact with someone from that group, then this slide shows the three criteria that we are looking for, that we were able to draw from the literature. And the first one is to comply with preference. So representing communities the way that they want to be represented. And in fact, as an extension of that, some scholars note that it is our job for a project such as Museum in the Streets to establish a means of self-determination from the source communities. So in that case, it is Wabanaki, members of the Wabanaki group who are still living in Lewiston and Auburn. The second criteria is to avoid stylizing and stereotyping. So that's ensuring that the object or subject that is being portrayed is not being portrayed in a stereotypical manner, but rather going back to what we showed a couple slides ago and the daily activities that they do, for example. And so instead of playing into stereotypes. And then the third one is to make sure that we are portraying these groups in an accurate manner and an unbiased manner. And unbiased is incredibly important to keep our minds on because photographs, artwork that's not photographed, for example, paintings, pictures, those can all be biased, even if they're, even photographs can be biased. So we have to really think about whoever produced what we were trying to show, where their mindset was when they were trying to show it. So these three are the criteria that we're thinking about. And now we'll give an example. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the frame, there's a mural that many of you are familiar with. It's a mural by an American artist named Dean Cromwell, and he painted this, and it's actually features on the cover of the book All Know Back, which is about Wabanaki history in the area and in Maine. And so we've chosen this mural to feature as we consider which photographs to use and which are appropriate to use and which aren't.
And so the first criteria, complying with preference. So before choosing or not choosing this photo to put on a sign, we'd ideally reach out to a group, in this case Wabanaki Reach, to get their input on whether or not this is an accurate representation or the representation that they want in the community.
The second criteria, avoid stylizing and stereotyping. We really think that this mural actually falls short on this front, which is why we would recommend not using it for any of the signs. And the reason is because, well, the fact that it's a mural and not a photograph means that it's stylized. And when you look at it, the way Dean Cromwell drew the characters, so for example, the two fishermen on the left-hand side of the river and their poses, that's very stylized because he could have chosen to draw them in any particular position that involves the motion of fishing, but for example, their body language, the fact that there are pumpkins and gourds right in front of the river on the right-hand side or right next to the river, altogether when we look at this mural, it's showing very stereotypical activities that the Wabanaki and the Abenaki are known for in this, right around the Great Falls, and it brings it all together in in a stylized manner. So for those reasons, we aren't recommending using this one. And now we'll talk about the third criteria.
And then in terms of this work, art is inherently biased. So when choosing a piece of art as an image to accompany a sign, that's something you have to be wary of, is that, that the artist had a bias to begin with in painting it, and then the painting itself is open to interpretation, which can play into people's biases and stereotypes in general.
And so now we'll discuss deliverables. So the first deliverable is a compilation of all of the photographs of sign placements, which we showed an example of the first one. And so we have a document of each sign location and then 1 to 3 photos of where the placement of the sign can be, with rankings next to it that show which placement we've decided is the optimal placement. And then the next one is texts of all sign drafts that we've revised and edited, which again is a document, and Zeke showed an example of what an edited paragraph or an edited sign looks like with the red marks and everything. So we have submitted a document with all of the sign drafts and all of the marks that we've made.
The next deliverable is 2 introductory panels, one for Lewiston and one for Auburn, that we have drafted and shared in the Google Drive, as well as emailing to our partners. And yeah, so we've done drafts of those and we're awaiting kind of the response, and then we'll edit those. And then lastly, photos have been evaluated, the ones that are in the Google Drive, based on our original set of criteria, both for all images and for the subcategories of images. And we have recommendations for which photos we believe should be used and shouldn't be used that we would like to discuss after the presentation.
Finally, we would like to thank all of you for all of your support throughout this process. I know most of you are community partners, and we've drawn from your expertise all term long, and this MITS project wouldn't happen without all of the support and effort that you guys have given to both us and the project itself. And Francis and Karen, you've been so supportive the whole way, and I'm sure there were plenty of moments during this presentation where you thought, I remember having this discussion with them, seeing it materialize. So we really appreciate the work that all of you have done for this project. And the next steps are really simple. We're going to submit the materials, we're going to compile them entirely, and then the Museum in the Streets is going to be installed. Yeah, thank you.
And we'd like to open the floor to questions, if anyone has any.
Well, I would like to say something. It's been wonderful for you guys to help us, because I call myself the Neanderthal man. Finding these photos and dragging them into the right files are things you guys did in 5 minutes and would have taken me 5 hours. For the rest of the group that we've worked with, we're ready to send this information off the first week of January and hopefully have them up and running by April or May. So maybe this is something you can come back to for years and years and say, hey, this is what I contributed to. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll go Peter said is, I'll speak somewhat for maybe Eric as well, but when we did some of our kiosks in both communities, it's painful and it's tiresome to get the story right, to get the pictures right, to get the grammar right, no matter how many times you read it, somebody finds something on it. So if you guys too have done that, to take it this far, makes a huge difference for the communities as far as actually being able to fund these things and get them up. So you guys have really done a lot of that big work for the city, so it's appreciate that.
Thank you.
Just thank you for that. On behalf of Auburn.
I'd like to, mainly my interaction is with Mr. Zeke. I don't know what the other two of you contributed with regard to the text, the grammar, and so forth. I taught political science, but I was famous for correcting grammar and punctuation and so on.
Doug, that was all of us. That was a collective effort, but thank you.
All of you for detecting those problems.
You know, just add the chorus of appreciation. As someone who's been a part-time participant in what I think is a part-time project for all of us, it's really nice to have people who have dedicated as much energy and effort to moving so much forward so quickly. It's really marvelous to hear what you've done. But I also have a question, and I'm curious what you think are maybe some of the pieces that are the ones you're least comfortable with, or the ones that you hope that we'll look at most carefully, or I mean, basically, what are some of the things that feel a little bit less settled for you than you would like at this point? Are there particular images or particular signs?
We do have 2 signs. In terms of location, we feel good about all of the locations that were chosen except for a few of them, and that's something that we're hoping to discuss after the meeting more in detail. But overall, the map is like great, and it flows really well, and the route is great because you can break it up and not do both cities at the same time, which is great. But there are 2 locations that are set to be on the bridge from Auburn, or from Lewiston, where around the memorial into Auburn. And when we were walking that bridge, it was like pretty scary to be on the bridge with all the traffic. So like, there are just little things, I guess, in terms of like actually having walked the whole route a few times, like noticing where people might feel safe actually walking. That's one contribution that we're hoping to make, is like revised locations maybe for that. And
you follow up to the same question, is where within the project did you find it the greatest challenge to reach a conclusion? I guess I'm most interested in the text or the photos rather than in the placement. So within those sections, which really challenged you, and you're looking forward to the feedback to find out what happens to your decision?
So we were really lucky that Doug is an expert on a lot of the content. So in terms of the content of the signs, we basically just received drafts from Doug. And I think we would have to mostly focus on the photographs then. To answer your question, like where we're really looking forward to feedback is having the discussions about, and like the discussions following this presentation with our community partners and with Tom about what photos to choose, which ones are appropriate. Because we went through all of them on the Google Drive, and we have comments about each of them and where necessary and applicable, and we're looking forward to hearing most people's inputs about the photos, but especially the ones that involve social representation. I think we're really looking forward to feedback on those, and in particular because we recognize right now that we have it, like if collectively everyone who's helping put Museum in the Streets together, if we do it right and we represent the different communities that we are portraying on the panels well, then it'll be really, really successful, and it'll have a lot of economic and social value to like the downtown area of Lewiston and Auburn, from both like the visitor standpoint and also the resident standpoint, whoever the audience might be for Museum in the Streets. And this goes back to sense of place, which was one of our aims right in the beginning, where for the residents who will be able to take this walking route and learn more about the history, if we can feature all of the different communities and do it well, so representing Maine Wapanaki history, Little Canada, like the Irish, the French Canadian population, if we can do that well, that'll actually really add to the sense of place that residents have, no matter their ethnicity or their background, because that's because they'll get to understand how rich and the history really is. So in terms of those communities, the French Canadian communities, the 2 panels that feature Wapanaki history, that's where I think where we're most eager to hear people's feedback. Did that answer your question?
Sure.
Thanks.
I think on behalf of UCLA, I'd like to thank you very, very much, because one of the things that I enjoyed was when we first started, I was involved and I jumped in here and there because Kate was handling it and leading it, so I didn't have to worry about anything. But one of the things was that the diligence you worked with, and you were willing to kind of stop and postpone instead of having it put out last year when we were hurrying to do it. You know, took the time to really do what you said you know, and really make it right. And even though it's going to be the summer late, it's okay, because I think it's an even better product to be able to have it done correctly with everybody that's involved. So thank you very much for that.
I just wanted to add a thank you as well, just for the immense amount of work that you have accomplished and the discerning manner in which you conducted that work. It's incredible that you're able to balance both of those. And I think that the work that you did this semester has really put us in a position where we are poised to meet our deadline. And just a quick question, you can answer one or both of these, but was there anything as you were doing the research or just reviewing the science that especially surprised you or interested you in terms of the history of the area? And also, do you plan to come back in the future to visit the museum museums?
Don't give the wrong answer.
To live in LA.
I think in terms of anything surprising, I didn't come across anything. I mean, in writing the Lewiston and Auburn introductory panels, definitely learned a lot about the two cities that hadn't known before. But other than that, not so much surprising. But in terms of coming back and visiting, I'm a junior, so I'll be here next year and I'll be able to walk it.
Yeah, Marissa and I will walk it during the spring.
We're gonna walk it.
Yeah.
I think like less about the history of the cities and more about, like, I feel like we learned more about all of the different things that you have to consider when making a project like this. And now it feels obvious that you need input from so many different parties, but it was really valuable to see just how many people contribute to this project, and it'll stand for such a long time, and it's like really nice to see like steps that people are taking to make sure that certain peoples are represented properly and that like the right histories are being told, and like how many different times the topics have switched kind of opened our eyes to like what stories are important to tell in Lewiston and Auburn, which is cool.
How hard was it to stay within the word?
Pretty hard. There's so much cool history that each panel, and you want to tell it all, but got 130 words.
So, I mean, if you feel that that's getting the story across, getting the message across, or if we had the ability to add more verbiage with that, or would that just be too much? People lose interest.
No, you can go.
I think it's hard, but I think it's valuable to have such a like low word count because the purpose is for it to be a walking path, and it takes a long time to walk through all 30 of them, and so having more text on each I think would make it so that visitors wouldn't necessarily complete the path, or like, yeah, probably not, I don't know.
And I think what we would hope is that people might read those really short blurbs about the history on the signs and then go and research further. Or maybe visit the museums.
And a few notes too, for those of you who are hearing about this for the first time, we elected to do a somewhat shorter word count with a trade-off being that these will be translated into French as well. So there will be English on one side, French on the other, both because of the French-Canadian community as well as more recent arrivals from Africa who are French-speaking. So that's one thing where it kind of looks like there's more text on the panels than there actually is, because there's two short chunks in two languages, and that's another thing where the accessibility came into it. And another note too about this project is that This student group is one of two who have worked with us through Bates College. There was an environmental studies capstone project last spring. That group started right out with a big community survey that we sent out with a whole list of proposed topics, and community members indicated which ones they were interested in, what they wanted to hear about, what was special to them about Lewiston Auburn. So there's a whole bunch of work behind the scenes that all kinds of students did. And I was just thinking in this meeting, Francis, if you're up for it next semester, it would be really neat to have a group think about how to apply this, the signage to different programming. Like I could see a great, like a scavenger hunt for students, or lesson plans, or other things where we can use this content, or get the word out to people, so it'd be kind of like a marketing / public education thing. So your work is really great. You know, you picked it up right where the last group left off, and I think you've put us in a place that not only can we finish the project, but I think another group coming in will be able to work with some really great content. So thanks again.
Thank you.
And we're also going to transition. Are there any more comments for the students today?
I'm sorry, just one more question. Do you feel, so you're college students, you've learned about lots and lots of things, and I'm curious, as you were putting these signs together, whether you felt like there were any particular goals. And I mean that in the sense of Lewiston Auburn history perhaps particularly, but maybe even more generally in terms of what you, in terms of your own education, feel like these are important things for people to think about in whatever way, and yet we're not talking about them in these signs. I'm just, like, that's perhaps an overly broad and unfairly broad question, but I am kind of curious whether you felt like as you were doing this, you felt like there was something missing that was important, either historically, factually, but also perhaps interpretively, conceptually, even if they're not things that we can address.
On the historically, factually side, the shoe industry was so big in Auburn for so long, and we have 15 panels on the Auburn side of the river, and only a couple of them kind of skirt around the edge of addressing the shoe industry head on, and I think it'd be really cool to have a sign specifically about that. And so a couple of the signs, for example, like Night House, which included Downing Shoe Shop at one time, those are there because they're right along the route and they're historical landmarks that you can see so clearly, and so they really do have a place on the Museum in the Streets tour. But the Night House in particular is so much smaller than the shoe industry. So deciding what sign topics to include is definitely a big part of it, and I feel like you can't have it all, and the shoe industry is one example from a historical factual standpoint.
I think in terms of like recent immigration, like especially the African immigration, there's one sign that I think was originally African markets but might have just been changed to immigration. Mm-hmm. But that seemed, and that's hard to tell because it's so recent, like what the long-term implications of all of this immigration is, but I think it would have been nice to have more representation because it's such a huge thing that's going on right now. And it's hard to tell that if like years down the road how significant this is going to be, but it feels very significant now, and it would have been nice to have more representation in that aspect, in that regard.
I'm a visitor here from Auburn. I just want to make a comment. I think most of you are all here because you're from LA, and this is a project you're really excited about. I live farther up the Androscoggin Valley. I'm trying the project I'm working on, and I've approached people here like Kate and Joe about Maine Wabanaki Beach, who I serve. I'm trying to connect Lewiston Auburn with Quebec in a project, which is how the original people, the indigenous people of this area, experience their lives and their whole story. And so I've been visiting in Quebec. I've been visiting up in northern Vermont, and up the valley here where I live. I live near Jay. I live in the Androscoggin Valley too. there's a lot of really high quality work being done by other communities, and including their museums. And what you're doing here is world class. Okay? And so many of you have visited Quebec, I'm sure, different parts like Quebec City and Montreal. Sherbrooke, closest, maybe you know Sherbrooke, maybe you know Drummondville, maybe you know Odenak, which is part of the world that people came from here. They really do things world class as soon as you get over our border here into French Canada. And what you're doing here is right there. And this project is world class. And that's my little message for all of you for what you're doing. And thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think our group of community partners is taking advantage of us all being in the same room at the same time because we have our January deadline coming up. So I know we want to get a little bit more targeted feedback from maybe Wabanaki Reach. So maybe we can talk about those photo selections, and then our group will figure out whatever goals we need to develop. So if you want to stick around for that part of it, feel free. But yes, apologies because we're going to dive into some more detailed stuff. Is it possible to move the chairs into a circle, or should we
We
leave
can
them
move them
as-
anywhere you want to. Slide on the table.
Good job, guys.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That was scary. They asked such different questions in the class.
And I was
Yeah.
doing
For that last one,
was
with
anybody else coming
the
in?
historical things, I was like, should I or should I not say Bates College?
You guys did a great job.
Thank you so much.
It's really interesting. I work at the Harvard Center. Sam Boss couldn't be here, so he asked me, and I'm so glad he did.
Wow.
That was really wonderful.
Thanks for coming.
And I love, it sounds like such an interesting project. Did you all develop the matrix with the different criteria, or did?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really cool.
Yeah.
Either way, it's fine.
That was
Yeah, it was
Yeah, that was a
big
lot
part
of
of it.
research. We definitely